Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into Madame Bovary, and we're going to unpack it not just as a tragic tale, but as a revolutionary proto-cinematic masterpiece. Gustave Flaubert published this novel way back in 1857, and it fundamentally changed the entire landscape of literature. Now, you probably know it as the classic story of a provincial wife whose desperate search for passion ultimately ruins her life. But today, we're really going to peel back the layers. We're looking at the deep-seated illusions that drove Emma Bovary, and honestly, more importantly, we're looking at the mind-bending, almost time-traveling techniques Flaubert used to tell her story. Okay, let's just dive right in with a pretty fascinating confession from the author himself. Madame Bovary is me. I love this quote because it instantly humanizes Flaubert. It proves he wasn't just sitting up in some ivory tower judging his character, you know? He actually shared his heroine's weakness for romantic illusion, for those sentimental flights of fancy, and for that deep melancholy. He absolutely understood the temptation of looking at a perfectly ordinary life and just wishing for a grand, cinematic romance. He just used a highly self-conscious irony to critique those very desires. So Section 1, Romanticism versus Harsh Realism. Here we're examining the devastating collision right at the very heart of the novel.
What's really interesting here is the stark, undeniable line drawn between Emma's fictional fantasies and her painfully boring life with her husband, Charles. On one hand, you have Emma. She's the ultimate romantic dreamer. Ever since her girlhood in a convent, she's practically fed on romantic novels, and she's craving an impossible, all-consuming passion. And then you have Charles. Poor Charles is a simple, hard-working realist. He loves Emma dearly, for sure, but he is completely and utterly blind to her desires. He lacks the intelligence and the fiery passion she demands. So their marriage is essentially this constant, agonizing friction between the grand romance Emma expects and the completely tedious reality Charles actually provides.
Moving on to Section 2, a geography of disillusionment. Let's see how Emma's tragedy is deeply anchored in specific physical places. Think of this geographic roadmap as a progressive visual sequence of Emma's increasing desperation. Flaubert uses setting brilliantly to mirror what's going on inside her head. First up, we have Rouen, where Emma experiences initial joy and builds her romantic illusions at a convent school. That city basically represents her youthful dreams. But then she marries Charles and moves to Tostes. Tostes is the mundane. It's the ultimate tedium of domestic life, and it's so unbearable for her that Charles actually moves them to our third location, Yonville-l'Abbaye, hoping it's going to be a fresh start. But Yonville, it's this stagnant, stubborn place with poor soil and people who completely resist change. And it's right here, in this suffocating environment, that Emma seeks out romantic escapades with men like Leon and Rodolphe, which ultimately seals her ruin. All right, Section 3, Trapped by Society's Rules. Let's talk about the societal forces boxing Emma in. So Emma's moral ruin wasn't entirely her own doing. The intersecting forces of misogyny and circumstance totally cornered her, leaving her with almost zero real agency. She's trapped in the 19th century French bourgeoisie. She has a complete lack of financial independence. If she had the wealth of her lover Rodolphe, she could just buy the lifestyle she's dreaming of. But instead, sexuality becomes her only currency. When she racks up this crushing debt trying to buy a beautiful life, she's literally forced to beg men for money using her body. Flaubert is showing us that adultery wasn't just a moral failing for Emma. In her mind, and in that rigid society, it was the only imagined escape hatch for a sensitive, ambitious woman. Which brings us to Section 4, the proto-cinematic novel. This is where our explainer takes a really fascinating turn from what the story is about to exactly how it's told. Sourced from an analysis by Dr. Serena Kay in an academic journal, we're going to completely reframe Flaubert today. I want you to imagine an author writing a book in the 1850s, long before the motion picture camera was even a thing, who acts entirely like a visionary film director. When he describes a scene, like the middle of the night when a messenger arrives for Charles, he's basically creating a highly detailed storyboard. He gives us the frame, a maid opening an attic window. He gives us the involuntary gestures, like the maid visibly shivering in the cold. And then he zeroes in for a close-up on a tasseled woolen cap and a letter wrapped in a rag. It is astonishingly precise, giving these exact sensory and compositional cues, just like you'd see in a modern screenplay. And that precision brings us to a really revolutionary literary term, free indirect style. This is a technique Flaubert perfected, and it acts as the text equivalent of a subjective camera shot. So the narrator is speaking in the third person, but the language itself is totally saturated with Emma's feelings and perspective. We just slowly glide right into her internalized subjectivity. We get to see the world through her desperate romantic eyes. Without the author, everyone's having to use the word I. Now consider the cinematic rack focus. In film, that's when you shift the clarity from the background to the foreground, or vice versa. Well, Flaubert does this exact thing, but he does it with emotion. One moment, he puts us right inside Emma's skin. We feel her heartbeat, we strain our eyes with her, we experience this extreme, almost suffocating intimacy. And then, in a flash, the prose pulls back, and we're looking at her from an icy, judgmental, purely observational distance. It's an absolute masterclass in shifting points of view. He even acts as a sound designer. I mean it. In his famous agricultural fair chapter, Flaubert intentionally creates this multi-layered, textured soundscape. He literally overlays the bellowing of bulls with the romantic murmurs of a seduction, all while local politicians are just shouting phrases in the background. He explicitly stated he wanted to transfer the values of a symphony into literature. And he does it. He creates a vibrating totality of sounds that you can practically hear right through the page. Finally, Section 5, Flaubert's enduring visual illusion. Let's look at how he utilizes impressionistic visual notation to make the text feel completely alive. Listen to this quote for a second. The wind on the high road blew up clouds of dust, afar off a dog sometimes howled, and the bell, keeping time, continued its monotonous ringing. Notice how those sensory details create a deeply palpable atmosphere. Flaubert focuses heavily on the feel of seeing and hearing. The clouds of dust, the howling dog, the cracked, monotonous bell. He's actually anticipating the Impressionist painters by focusing on atmospheric mutations, like dust, smoke, and vapor, to completely convey Emma's overwhelming boredom and the emptiness of her surroundings. And this atmospheric manipulation just continuously builds. In the scene where Emma gets a rejection letter from her lover, Rudolph, Flaubert uses an impressionistic ray of light to literally pull the reader into Emma's physical vertigo. The luminous ray that came straight up from below drew the weight of her body towards the abyss. Light in Madame Bovary isn't just background illumination, it's active. It alters the appearance of everything it touches, and right here it acts as a physical gravitational force. It's a purely visual cinematic effect rendered entirely in text. Now here's a massive irony for you. This highly visual author completely hated the idea of illustrating his novel. He vehemently rejected any pictorial drawings for Madame Bovary. Why? Because he believed that the second you draw a picture of a character, it kills the reader's imagination. As he put it, a drawing makes a woman look like one particular woman, case closed. But written words allow the reader to dream of 1,000 different women. He wanted his prose to be the only lens through which the audience projected their own visuals. So I want to leave you with this final thought for our explainer today. Emma Bovary was destroyed because she absolutely could not reconcile the grand, curated illusions of her romance novels with the mundane reality of her everyday life. Today, we don't just have novels, right? We have movies, television, and these perfectly curated social media feeds constantly selling us impossible ideals. Are we, like Emma, still chasing a cinematic illusion, completely blind to the reality right in front of us? It's a question Flaubert posed over a century and a half ago, and honestly, it might be more relevant right now than ever. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today, and keep questioning the narrative.